Citizen Sleeper 2 Starward Vector is just days away for those keeping a patient eye on those countdowns. Recently, we were lucky enough to chat to the creator, Gareth Damian Martin, about all things Citizen Sleeper, find out what goes into the foundations of a game like this, and how you expand on the original when approaching a sequel. Citizen Sleeper 2 Starward Vector launches on the 31st of January and can be found where all good games are sold, and if you want to dip your toe in and try it out, the original is on Game Pass, and the sequel is coming too at release. Hope you enjoy the interview. I'm wondering, was the intention when you started that, like, when that first seed of an idea hit you about creating Citizen Sleeper, what were the key beats that you wanted to make sure you hit? Was it things like anarchy? Was it the self-worth? Was it identity? What were the main ones you wanted to make sure you got right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that because I started with experience for Citizen Sleeper is that I did start with this idea of precarity as being very important and thinking about what that might mean and what that means in a contemporary sense. But I think that for me, Citizen Sleeper really starts at a very real and personal level, but also a very real lived experience that I wanted to represent. I think I wanted the opportunity to write about an experience that I'd had and that had been very formative to my life and to my understanding of all of those things you just said, right? That was the crucible which I kind of began to understand myself in the world and the world around it. And so it felt like that was actually the starting point. And so rather than necessarily set out to kind of hit a load of topics, I think I really began with thinking about how can I make a video game, and a science fiction video game, because I love science fiction, that kind of takes a player through this experience. Like what are the kind of gameplay and mechanical aspects, but also what are the narrative aspects? And actually the first thing I wrote for Citizen Sleeper was that opening scene where you're waking up. And waking up was always kind of going to be a big part of it, because I think waking up is a big part of life for me. For whatever reason, it's something that I'm really interested in. And it's, I have a lot of vivid dreams, and sometimes I wake up and I feel like I'm in a different reality, and it takes a while for that previous reality to fade. And I think that's had a big influence on me throughout my life, is that vivid dreaming on my feelings about reality and how solid or subjective it can be. And so I really want to start at this point of kind of waking up where we discover ourselves again each day. You know, we find the pains in our body and they appear, and it just, I don't know, it's just such a rich moment of life for me. And so the first thing I wrote was I'm going to write a waking up scene. So the game should begin with a waking up scene. And so I sat down and really wrote that. And that scene has barely changed from the first draft. I think, just kind of copy edited and cleaned up a bit. But I think that kind of captured a lot of what I wanted to do, especially with the prose and the writing of the game, where I really wanted to have this sense of interiority that prose can give. And have the body be present immediately, immediately have a character who's talking about their bodily experience, because I don't think that's something that happens very much in games, and it felt very important for what I wanted to do. And it just felt necessary for telling a story that was going to be about the gig economy, but also about trying to live with yourself, yourself being not just who you think of yourself as, but actually what the role you're cast in, as you kind of put it, And so, yeah, all of these things just kind of started to come out. And I think actually Citizen Sleeper 1 was quite an explorative process in that sense. When I was writing it, I was very much just kind of trying to get through things that I'd been thinking about and getting them on paper. And sometimes I did that through characters. Like Lemamina was a lot about my experience of parenthood and kind of thinking through that. And a lot of the theories, the kind of 3-body problem things that I kind of manufactured in my head of thinking about those things. And then sometimes it's through other characters, and sometimes it was through the sleeper's voice. But it was really, for me, an explorative process about digging into what my experience had been and trying to understand why that experience had been so formative and felt important in a wider sense. It felt not that my particular experience was important, but that it might be connected to a lot of other people's experience. It just felt like, well, actually loads of people have probably been through similar things, and that this kind of precarity and exposure to risk and relationship with our bodies, it just felt like something I was seeing everywhere all around me. And so it was well, I think there's something productive maybe of beginning to open this conversation with other people and being the one to be vulnerable, right, and open up the space and say and invite people to come and speak with me there.
So when it comes to, having the foundation of Citizen Sleeper 1 and then deciding to make a sequel, is there key aspects that you wanted to make sure were kind of carried over, or were there key aspects in the second one that you wanted to cover that you didn't necessarily want to include in the first one? Because you can end up in a situation where people are like, oh, I want Citizen Sleeper 2 because I just want more Citizen Sleeper. And I'm sure as a creator, you're like, that's something that I could do, but also I have this medium to be able to tell more or to do something different or to expand it in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I definitely didn't want to do more Citizen Sleeper from the perspective of it just being more a continuance. And I think I just saw, I think in a way, like seeing everybody react to the game and seeing this kind of like people helping me understand the game meant that I was able to make a sequel in terms of carrying things through. Like it's almost impossible to figure out which individual things informed my understanding of my own game in order to make a sequel, because there were so many, right? I've read so many, everything from like comments, Steam reviews, podcasts, having all of these discussions like we are having now, right? And like when I say I'm a person who thinks when they speak, I often surprise myself when I say things. I'm like, oh, I didn't know that that's what I meant. But for me, verbalizing is the way that I think. And so having the opportunity to talk so much about the game because so many people connected with it, and also then hear other people coming back and saying, well, actually, I think, there's this, people would say things like there's this theme of food throughout the game, and like food is so important in the game. And I'm like, yeah, it is really important. Completely unintentional, just a natural effect of my own interest in food and its relationship in our lives. And then so all of a sudden, so making a sequel becomes an opportunity to then take that and kind of like maybe build on it a bit more intentionally and take this kind of outpouring and shape it a bit more. So that's kind of something that I really wanted to do in the sequel and felt like a good opportunity. And then equally, I think there's this kind of story, Citizen Sleeper 1 is a kind of story I love, which is a very urban story about somebody at the bottom of the kind of social ladder or the food chain in a city trying to make things work. I think I've always loved those stories. Some of my favorite books and films are about that. And I wanted to do one of those stories, but having done one of those stories, I was like, well, there's lots of other sci-fi stories I really like. And one story that I really love is the kind of ship and crew story that I always think of as kind of in its optimum version as being like flatmates in space. Basically, it's about a group of people occupying the same space. And so I think that was something that was like, okay, well, that's something that I've always wanted to tell one of those stories. And it feels like Citizen Sleeper is really nicely attuned. And I would be excited to try to find out what is the Citizen Sleeper version of that story. Like, what does Citizen Sleeper bring to that kind of story? And so that made all of that kind of convinced me that like a sequel would be different and interesting enough. Along with the feeling that really I just offered people a kind of a small version of what I could do in a sense with Citizen Sleeper with mechanically, because I wasn't sure that people would love it. And so knowing people would love it, it's like, well, I have lots of other mechanics that I'd like to add and lots of other structures. So yeah, it just seemed like I wasn't done, and this was a good opportunity to kind of make something more interesting on top of this.
Who's about going to different places and traveling and this whole like space starship thing. And so it's a case of, are you interacting with the same characters throughout the story? Can you go back and visit them? Or is it a case of, here is the isolated story involving these characters. Some will join your crew, and so their stories will continue. but some of them you are literally leaving there and they will continue on without you. Like, how does that work?
Yeah, so you can kind of travel back and forth, but also stories are linked to specific times. So
Okay.
it depends story to story. Like, the starting point for me, always with characters for Citizen Sleeper, is I always have to have like a strong pitch in my head as like a really core, like something very simple, like a like with the Lemon character, like a dad who wants to get his kid, adoptive dad who wants to get his kid off to this station to a new future, right? And the colony ship, and they have these like big like headline pieces of the story that I then want to play out. But then I think I often think about like what are all of the interesting things that could happen within a story like that. One of my favorite ever things about game design is like from the game Firewatch has like a commentary mode where you can go around and find little commentary
Yes.
nodes about the game. And in one of them, they talk about how when they first came up with the idea for Firewatch, they wrote down all of the interesting things that could happen in a game where you have a radio. So they were like, well, you could speak on the radio and hear your voice coming from somewhere and find a radio. You could have your radio intercepted by somebody else and someone you don't know could start talking on it. You could, they came up with just this big long list, and then they tried to find ways of like fitting those into the game because they knew those moments would be really exciting and interesting. And I always think this is like a really great way of thinking about games, because I think the best moments in games are often when the rules are broken as opposed to when the rules are followed. And so I think about a similar thing for stories, which is, so with Citizen Sleeper 2, I think a lot of the story is really just based around me thinking like, oh, I really want to have this moment happen in this story, or this would be a really interesting moment to happen in this story. And I think moving around allows me for like a lot of like almost mini time skips sometimes. So like some characters will come with you and stay with you. But even then, those characters won't necessarily be at the forefront of the story if they're with you. And so they might kind of disappear into the background for a while, and then they'll come back to you and they'll be like, oh, something's happened. And so I can have lots of these layered like mini time skips where the world kind of feels like it's moving without you in a really exciting way. And I think something I learned from Citizen Sleeper 1 is that you can make a lot of kind of stories with gaps in them, and then have the player start those stories at different times depending on their choices, and it starts to become this really complex like web. But actually from a mechanical and design engineering perspective, it's just a series of straight lines. But because there's gaps in those lines, those gaps, this is a big part of my theories of game design, but like is that those gaps allow for other things to happen in the gaps, and therefore to create this kind of like intersecting structure. And so I think for me, like the possibility of that also being complicated by not knowing where the player might go next each time they leave a place. I don't know where. I know one of 4 or 3 places. And so the way the game world works is like an area of like 10 kind of hub type areas that you slowly unlock over the course of the game, and you can go back through. So I don't always know the way the player will cycle through those, but I have different ways of leaving breadcrumbs around. Sometimes there might be something that only happens if you reach a specific place. Some things might be only if a certain number of cycles pass. Some things might happen only if you meet a certain kind of requirements. But because all of those things are happening simultaneously, there's this really nice process where things start to layer on top of each other and bleed into each other in a really interesting way. So that was kind of my focus, is like building up this volume of different types of stories. So things like stowaway stories, or stories about like stories about characters who are on the ship with you, or stories about characters leaving the ship and then what happens to them. One of the really fun things is like having characters like you arrive at a place and characters are like, oh, I'm going off somewhere, and you're like, okay, bye, and then you see them later on, like again, like a little mini time skip. You're suddenly they're in the background of a scene in a bar, having a drink with somebody, and it's kind of like allowing to like really layer up these stories became really fun for Citizen Sleeper 2. And traveling around in a way just creates more opportunity for that.
With the dice system in the first game being very efficient at what it does and very polished in its approach, was there any thought process to, I don't need to mess with this and I can just tell a new story behind this interface? Or were there aspects that you cut from the first game that you were like, well, now I can add these mechanics in for the second game? Or like, how do you approach evolving or changing a system when it feels like it does everything it needs to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think I I wouldn't be making a sequel unless I felt like there was a way to evolve that. And I think that for me, it was that I wanted to tell a different kind of story. And so therefore, the kind of dice system that I had invented was really best for telling the kind of story that I'd wanted to tell in Citizen Sleeper 1. And so I needed to change that because I wanted to tell a different kind of story. And I think in particular, I immediately went to this idea that you mentioned earlier about Shadowrun, but for me comes from Blades in the Dark, which is the idea of like the kind of job downtime structure, right? The like
Yeah.
it's almost like a classic RPG thing, but I like it in particular where it's emphasized and it's this kind of like Dishonored or something, where it's like you go on a heist and then you come back and then you have the downtime and then you go out again. You know, I always love that structure in anything. I don't know why, but it just really works for me. And
Yeah.
because I'd taken so much inspiration from Blades in the Dark for the first game, I was like, well, this is top of my list. I want to make this dice system work for an uptime, downtime kind of type structure. And at the same time, I was very aware that in Citizen Sleeper 1, I'd created a dice system to have this very specific experience of decline that I'm very happy with. But it's a kind of almost like inevitable, like ongoing decline, right? You're always kind of like desperate to get to the stabilizer, and then you're getting back up again, and you're kind of like healthy again, and you're going to try it, and then the decline starts again, and you're continually in this. And I think that pattern is great for that story, but I think for a story where I wanted the player to push their luck and to go on these like high risk kind of jobs and then like have to deal with lots of chaotic things going on at once, and they want them to come back and try and recover and to reflect and then to build up to another one of those, I needed a totally different way of thinking about harm. And I think one of the objectives I had was I wanted to think about trying to model slightly more long-term harm in a video game, because I think it's really rare, but it's something that happens in tabletop games quite a lot.
Yeah.
And so
yeah.
I hit on this idea of stress that I wanted to work with, but also with like the dice breaking, which is what happens in Citizen Sleeper 2, and the dice each having their own health bar. And so the idea being that like you might go on a contract, and in a moment of pushing your luck, you might try to like, you're trying to kind of like get this moment of like, yeah, I'm going to complete this mission exactly at this right moment, and then it goes wrong. It goes wrong and you break your dice and you fail, but the game keeps going.
Yeah.
And then you now have a broken dice. And having a broken dice is not just like, oh, well, I'll just take a health potion. It's like, no, I have to fix this. I have to get the equipment that I need to, like, I have to get the items that I need to fix this. And that's like a quest in itself. You know, maybe you already have them to hand, maybe you got them already if you prepared yourself. But if you didn't, then you have to then go out and do that. And it implies a story that continues from there, a story of like coming back and recovering. And then there's a factor to recovering in Citizen Sleeper 2 as well, which is that there's this new thing called glitch, which is like the level of glitchiness of your body. And that goes up when you fix yourself with like easily available but inferior components. There are like rare components that you can use to fix yourself, or you can fix yourself with scrap components. And it takes a lot more scrap components to fix yourself, but also you take on a lot of glitch. And so even when you fix that dice, if you fix it with glitch components, you're then glitched, and then your dice might glitch, and it takes a time. Each time you roll a glitch dice, you expend a little more of your glitch until you run out of it, and then you're back to normal. And so there's this whole process to kind of recovering from a single dramatic event that takes up a kind of portion of the game. And that was something that I really, really wanted to like path out. And when we're talking about the kind of gaps that encourage like stories to appear and players to think and players to reflect, is I really wanted this kind of balance of, you go on these high intensity jobs and you're kind of constantly pushing your luck and you're trying to find a way through. Then you also have this time to recover and time to reflect and build up into something new. Just felt like a really fun and exciting thing to explore, and something that, again, like I think I hadn't seen a lot in games. There's a few games that do it. I think Darkest Dungeon does it a little bit. Banner Saga does it a little bit. And where like harm and difficulty accrues over the course of a playthrough as well. And yeah, there's lots of little details like that, like that I added to the game to try and like emphasize this feeling of like needing to recover and building up stress and having to come back from things, and just try to explore that bodily reality of the sleeper and really make the bodily reality of the sleeper be part of the gameplay. It's not just a game about managing the job. It's a game about managing yourself.
Yeah.
Is the primary bit of management that you're doing in the game. So you're managing your own health. And it's a complex equation in Citizen Sleeper 2 in a way that I think I'm really satisfied with now as a way of building on Citizen Sleeper 1, which had I think a very stark and clear metaphor for that, but that maybe was lacking in nuance. And I think like there's a lot more nuance to Citizen Sleeper 2, but it's quite a different kind of story because of that.
At this point, everything's done, and it's now just that anxiety and trepidation, I guess, of waiting for reviews and then release.
Yeah. It's slightly terrifying. I don't know. It's amazing that I get to sleep every night. But it's very exciting, but it's very scary. I'll be glad when the game is just out there and we can just talk about it openly. And but yeah, no, it is. It's a fun moment though. I try to remind myself that these things only come around every few years or so, so it's good to try and enjoy it when it's here.
Well, to everyone that's watching this, if you are interested in these games, please go and pick up either Citizen Sleeper 1 or Wishlist number 2. Is wishlisting helps out, I think, far more than people ever truly realize when it comes to smaller games. I'm sure that Citizen Sleeper 2 is just going to just be a tidal wave of people yelling at you about their favorite characters and the emotional destruction you have caused them. Which will be great.
People just grinning at me, being like, "You made me cry."
Yeah.